So, one important question to address early on is how do we distinguish psychotic or manic experiences and belief from spiritual experiences and beliefs that aren't a problem and where no help is needed? Now, both are likely to involve perceptions and beliefs about matters beyond that which is consensually measurable. So, there are two approaches to making this kind of distinction. One is looking at what's culturally normal, and then another is looking at what helps a person versus what hurts them. Now, psychiatry would say that someone is psychotic if they're perceiving or believing something that's culturally abnormal and is causing them problems in functioning. Based on this kind of criteria, for example, it's been found that between 25 and 39% of patients diagnosed with schizophrenia and 15 to 22% of those diagnosed with mania or bipolar disorder have religious delusions. And psychiatry sees its job as suppressing such experiences as much as possible. It generally offers little attention to the possibility that an experience could be culturally abnormal, cause big problems in functioning at some point, but still be valuable in important ways. When anyone brings up this kind of possibility, they're typically accused of romanticizing psychosis or romanticizing mental illness. Now, I have run into some people who really do seem to just want to look at the positive side of anomalous or culturally abnormal experiences. Now, that is unbalanced, and it could fairly be called romanticizing. But it seems to me most of the mental health system is also unbalanced by only wanting to look at the negative side of these experiences, which we could call awfulizing people's experiences or pathologizing them. And when we do that, we lose our ability to fully relate to people about what they're going through. Let me tell a story to illustrate. Dina Tyler is a leader in the peer support movement now, but some years ago she had an experience where she suddenly seemed to have discovered the meaning of life. Now, that was in a context where she hadn't been sleeping for a number of nights. She got very excited about having discovered the meaning of life, so she called all her friends and family to give them the good news. And she thought she thought people would come by to express their appreciation of what she discovered. But instead, they came by to take her to the hospital. And at the hospital, the professionals told her she was manic and that all her ideas were just part of a manic psychosis and that she just had a delusion that she had discovered the meaning of life. But when she got out of the hospital, she did some reading and she found out that her ideas that she'd come up with about the meaning of life matched up pretty closely with Maslow's very famous ideas about the hierarchy of needs. Now, Maslow's theory was psychological, but it also has a spiritual dimension. Now, while after her hospitalization, she had an opportunity to go back to that hospital, but this time as a speaker to give them some feedback about what her hospital experience had been like. And she asked them why, since many of them had training in Maslow's hierarchy, did none of them recognize the connection between Maslow's ideas and what she'd been telling them about. They could have told her something like, hey, it sounds like you're talking about some very important ideas, but actually you aren't the first to think about these things. And maybe we could help you calm down and get some sleep and put what this means into a better perspective. That would have felt much more helpful to her. But that would have only been possible if they'd had an openness to seeing something of value with what otherwise looked like a case of manic psychosis. So, one way to make sense of experience like Dina's is that, well, maybe she wasn't having an experience based on illness. Maybe she was really having a spiritual experience about the meaning of life, and she was just having some confusion and difficulties doing that in a balanced way, which was creating what could be called a spiritual emergency. Now, there are many who would say that spiritual emergency can be understood as being categorically different from having a true mental disorder like bipolar mania or psychosis. They will say that psychosis itself can still be understood to be of no spiritual value, even if people who are psychotic might often mistakenly think that their experiences do have spiritual value. So the idea from this point of view is that professionals should be trying to distinguish between experiences that are really spiritual emergency and those that are really mania or psychosis or mental illness, and then only focus on drugs and suppression of the experience when it's really a mental illness. There's a big problem with that, though, and that is we don't have any clear criteria for making such distinctions. One study where they did try it just turned out a mess. There were way too, by far the bulk of the experiences came up as intermediate, couldn't really be sorted out. Also, it seems it's not so much the experiences themselves, but what people make of the experience that determines whether the experience contributes to someone's growth or not. And what people make of their experiences is affected by the context they're in. It's affected by things like how others relate to them and their experience. And that affects whether or not the experiences they have can be integrated into the rest of their life. So a key thing here is that framing someone's experience as nothing but an illness can actually become part of what impairs people's ability to relate to themselves and their experience. So it can become basically part of a self-fulfilling prophecy. If people define their experience as illness, then they become less able to find anything of value in it. And so they might miss out on really important opportunities for growth. So what I'm proposing is to take a point of view that's more complex than the mental illness versus spiritual emergency perspective. I think it's helpful to recognize there may be a continuum of how experiences occur, with lots of experiences being of a mixed type. So some seem to more obviously have something helpful or positive in them, even though there might also be important difficulties or rocky points. Others maybe seem much darker and destructive, but it's still possible that something in those experiences will become important in the person's development. We don't know where a person's process will lead. And as Winston Churchill said, when you're going through hell, keep going. The process of experimenting with how to understand or relate to tricky experiences is something we need to keep going with to help people eventually get to a good place. And a big part of that involves helping people avoid either over or undervaluing particular experiences. Over and undervaluing experiences might make you think of mood swings. I've been talking a lot about psychosis, but this seminar is also about bipolar disorder, which consists of radical emotional changes and mood swings from episodes in which a person feels abnormally euphoric, optimistic, and energetic, to periods in which they feel sad, hopeless, guilty, and sometimes suicidal. But bipolar disorder and other forms of madness or psychosis are not clearly separable categories. There's increasing evidence for phenomenological, biological, and genetic risk overlap between what we call psychotic disorders, that are called schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder on the other hand. Traditionally, it was said that schizophrenia was a thought disorder, while bipolar involves affect. But more recent research highlights the role of affect and difficulties integrating negative affect in all kinds of psychotic disorders. On the other hand, periods of spiritual crisis, spiritual conversion experiences, and transformation also typically involve intense affect. Spiritual experiences typically appear special in their degree of profundity and meaning for the individual and seem to go beyond mundane consensus reality. And this kind of going beyond can seem in a positive direction or a negative, or can alternate back and forth from things like dark nights of the soul to seemingly brilliant illumination. So also as we move along today, I think you'll notice that we're talking about a variety of bipolarities and not just bipolarity around affect. When people lose their normal balance, they can go to a variety of extremes and often flip back and forth between one extreme or another, such as having a person can have their mind way too open or way too closed, having a very narrow identity versus having a very wide one. These extremes often cause various kinds of problems, but they can also be something valuable to experience, especially once put in perspective as part of something bigger.